morning.
Good morning.
So, last week we finished up our series in Esther. So this week we start a brand new series. And so we'll be going through the Sermon on the Mount over the next several weeks. And so specifically at the beginning, we've got the Beatitudes. So we'll be going through today the first of the Beatitudes. And so the Sermon on the Mount is the most famous sermon of all time. And so I'm really excited to study it in depth with you guys. And as we study this Sermon on the Mount, we're going to be looking at several of the inner attitudes that Jesus says we should have, the Beatitudes. And what we'll soon find out is that these inner attitudes, they contrast quite a bit to what our world says we should feel. It's different than what our world tells us we should feel. And so I've decided to name this series the Upside Down Kingdom, as opposed to the Right Side Up Kingdom, the kingdom of this world. Because what Jesus tells us to do does not match with the kingdom that we are in right now. He's different. His kingdom is different. His kingdom is upside down. And so at the very beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, the first 12 verses, Jesus tells us about these inner attitudes we should have. And like I said, these are often called the Beatitudes. And so over the next couple of weeks, we'll be going down this list one by one and see what Jesus has to tell us about the upside down kingdom. Jesus tells us that these inner attitudes are what can make us happy forever. And that's what we all want, right? To be happy. Everyone seems to be in a frantic search for happiness, and it has always been the case for Americans since the beginning. Even the initial formation of America was based on the search for happiness and a happier life. The quest for happiness was even built into the Declaration of Independence. It says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal, that are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Right? Happiness. The pursuit of happiness is not just a privilege, but it's a right. It's a right. We have a right to be happy. So if happiness is a right, why aren't more of us happy? Why aren't more people in your workplace happy? Why do so many kids today seem to be so unhappy? And can I get a little more personal? Why aren't you more happy? Why is it?
Too much.
That's a good answer. I like that. Now this question is tried to be answered quite a few times. And so there's no shortage on advice on how to be happy. And so I Googled this week the phrase, how to be happy. And this week I got 3,940,000 results. 3,940,000. Now I didn't take time to read all of those results, but out of a few of those I found things like 11 steps to happiness, 7 secrets to being happier, 101 ways to happiness, 30 days to be a happier you, 99 ways to be happier every day, 75 ways to raise a happy baby, and 1,008 secrets of a happy marriage. There has never been more advice available to us today on how to be happy. And yet for some reason, there's never been a time where more people have been unhappy. Why is that? What I want to suggest to you this morning is that it's because we're searching for happiness in all the wrong places. Searching for happiness in all the wrong places. Our world tells us that our happiness is found in external circumstances. Our inclination is that happiness starts on the outside and works its way in. We have the idea that if I'm happy out here, then I'll be happy in here. When I get out of school, then I will be happy. When I retire, then I will be happy. When the summer gets here, then I will be happy. When I can be with my family, then I will be happy. Most people think that happiness is going to be the result of just the right circumstances, the perfect circumstances. We just finished looking at Esther, and we saw right in chapter 1, this is how Xerxes lived his life. Him and the royal officials, they all lived this way. Their lives were miserable. Their lives had no purpose. Their lives had no hope. Last week in Sunday school, we even had a brief discussion on Ecclesiastes. King Solomon talks about how he used to live his life. He used to search for external things to bring him happiness. He searched for wisdom and wealth and power, but none of it satisfied. Ecclesiastes 2:1 says this, "I decided to enjoy myself and find out what happiness is. But I'm not happy. I'm empty within. There was a hole inside my soul, and I want to fill it up." Solomon had so much wealth it made Bill Gates look homeless. I mean, this is literally the richest man ever to live. King Solomon is known as the wealthiest man to ever walk the face of the earth, like in history of human beings. And here he is saying this isn't the answer. Wealth and power is not the answer. Let's look for something else here. Has this been your experience? Do you feel like you've tried so many things to try to be happy, but you feel like there's just a hole inside of you? The world tells us that happiness comes from external circumstances. The kingdom of the world tells us that the perfect circumstances and material things bring us happiness. But Jesus, in his Sermon on the Mount, tells us that happiness is an internal attitude. Happiness is not about what is happening outside of you, but rather what is happening inside of you. This is contrary to what most people think. That is because this attitude is of the upside-down kingdom.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
You know, my mom, when she was probably 103, she was rolling around her little walker in the house, and she said, "You know, Becky, I'm just as happy as I've ever been."
Mm-hmm.
And she was 103.
Wow.
And she was happy. She loved the Lord.
Thank you for sharing
But
that.
anyway,
Yeah,
I
that's
just had
great.
to say that.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's absolutely a perfect example of this. I mean, it's not the external things that bring you happiness, but it's internal, right? It's what's inside. And this is contrary to what most people think. And that's why this is an attitude of the upside-down kingdom, of Jesus' kingdom. And so Jesus, for the first time, shared this alternative way of living that will lead to happiness in his Sermon on the Mount. He was sitting on a hillside overlooking the Sea of Galilee, and he was talking to a group of people just like you and me, regular people. And they're all waiting to see what Jesus has to say about being happy. Because they've all tried the external things. They've all tried to satisfy themselves with the things of this world, and it just didn't work. And so here they are, seeking the advice of this guy. They're just waiting to see what he has to say about it. And Jesus begins the greatest sermon ever preached by looking at all of these people and saying, "You want to know how to be happy? Let me tell you. Let me tell you." And he makes these 8 statements called the Beatitudes. And each of these 8 statements in Matthew chapter 5, as you can see, all start with the same word. They all start with blessed, or blessed are you. The Greek word for blessed is actually the word makarios, and how the NIV translates it, it can be a little misleading. So the word makarios actually means happy. So instead of reading it blessed, we should read it happy. And these 8 things that Jesus said will make you happy, they almost all sound like contradictions. They almost don't make sense. He says things like, happy are the poor in spirit. Happy are those who mourn. Happy are the meek. Happy are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Happy are the persecuted. We look at these and we say, hang on a second, this doesn't make any sense. What is he saying? And that's because we look at these statements through the lens of the world. We look at these statements through the lens of the right side up kingdom, of our kingdom of the world. But as we walk through these Beatitudes, as we walk through these statements, I hope I can help you see these things with the lens of the upside down kingdom, of Jesus' kingdom. Jesus is saying that you can be happy despite your circumstances because it starts with your internal attitudes. That's where it starts. Jesus is saying you can actually be happy despite your external circumstances. You can be happy even though you're stressed. You can be happy even though you're going through hard financial times. You can be happy even though your marriage is having problems. Jesus is trying to make the point that happiness is not determined by what is happening around you, but what is happening in you. So how do you do that? Well, in Jesus' sermon, the first way that Jesus says that we find happiness is through humility. Let's take a look at what he says. Matthew chapter 5, verse 3. Blessed are the poor in spirit, or happy are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Now, when Jesus says poor in spirit, he isn't talking about people who are sad or depressed or, poor in spirit, like, oh, woe is me, I'm sad. He's not talking about that. To be poor in spirit means that you recognize your spiritual poverty. It means that without God, you have nothing, and you understand that. It means that you have to depend on God. You know that you have to depend on God. Without God, you have nothing. Poor in spirit means you look in the mirror and say, I realize that I don't measure up to God's standard of holiness. Every day I say things, think things, do things, and refuse to do things that just underscore that I'm spiritually bankrupt. And that takes some real humility to admit. The Greek word Jesus uses here for poor in spirit is ptokos. And it literally means one who is reduced to begging to others for their survival. Begging. It is like being in a deep hole that is so deep that you can't climb out. And the only hope that you have of getting out of this hole is to say to God that I am depending on you. I'm depending on your grace and power to lift me out of this. And that takes some crazy humility. Happy are those who can humbly acknowledge that they need God. These are the people that Jesus says are going to be happy forever. to admit that you need God, that you actually need Him. Jesus says that the kingdom of heaven, the upside-down kingdom, is for those that can admit that they do not deserve it. That can be really hard for us to admit. There was a giant convention held in Lexington, Kentucky for the governor of Kentucky, and thousands of people came to this convention to hear the governor talk about these social policies that he was going to introduce. And so there's a ton of people here, and right in the middle, they break for lunch, and all the people, these thousands of people, had to walk through the same line to get food. Thousands of people. This line is huge. All through this one line, and the governor's sitting there at the end, and he's like, man, I don't want to wait. And so he decides to cut everyone and go right to the front. And he gets his plate, and he sticks it out, and they put on the mashed potatoes and the corn, and he goes through all of these, and he gets to the very end, and he gets to the lady that hands out the chicken. And he lifts up his plate, and she gives him a thing of chicken. And he goes, oh, can I have two? I want two. And she goes, sorry, sir, you can only have one. Just one for everyone. And this man looks at her, and he says, do you know who I am? I'm the governor of the great state of Kentucky. I want 2 pieces of chicken, please. And she looks at him. She goes, I'm sorry, do you know who I am? I'm the lady who passes out the chicken. Now move along. That's what she said. Pride is an obnoxious thing. It gets in the way of humility. Pride or arrogance is the opposite of humility. It's ego. That's what the governor was struggling with. Pride inflates our self-importance. It makes us think we're more important than we really are. So instead of getting 1 piece of chicken like everyone else, we want 2. And just maybe, pride is what is standing between many of you and God right now. And maybe pride is what is standing in the way of you and happiness. Jesus is saying that by taking the low road of humility, you find the high road to happiness. Happiness and humility always go hand in hand. If you remember nothing else today, remember that happiness is found in humility. And I know what you're saying, that just doesn't make sense. How can humility increase my happiness? Well, let me give you 3 ways that they can. Humility improves our relationships with others. So there was an elderly man and woman who were brand new to this retirement home, and they started spending all their days together. And after a while, this man just fell in love with this woman, this old woman. And so he asked her to marry him. He asked her, will you marry me? And she said yes. She said yes. And so then they went to bed that night, and they woke up, and the man woke up, and he was having some trouble with his memory, and he couldn't remember what her answer was. Remember, she said yes or no. And so they sat down that morning for breakfast, and he kind of had to swallow his pride a little bit, and humbly admitted, hey, you said yes, right? I remember I asked you to marry me, but I can't remember your answer. And she said, oh, I'm so glad you asked. I remember someone asked me to marry them, but I didn't remember who it was. It's difficult to admit our weaknesses. But those that can humbly admit weaknesses in marriage and family and in their job and in relationships have a happier life, a much happier life. Their relationships are far better. Can you imagine if he decided to not swallow his pride and just kind of guess? I mean, what if he never talked about that? I mean, they would never know. They would just keep going about their lives and completely on different paths. Communication is important. But so is humility. The first step on the road to healing and repairing broken relationships is being able to have humility to say, hey, I messed up. Hey, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. Let's do a little survey here. How many of you like being around big-headed know-it-all people? Any of you? How many of you want to go to lunch with a conceited jerk today? No? I didn't think so. Seriously, though, let me ask you a serious question. How many of you would say that the root cause of tension in friendship, marriage, or in family is selfishness? Selfishness is what it leads to. I remember saying a couple of weeks ago that a lot of the time people think that religion can lead to superiority and egotistical behavior. A lot of people believe that religious people will come off with a superiority complex. And to be honest, I agree with it. I think that's true. I think religion leads to superiority. Because religion says that the more moral you are, the better you are in God's eyes. But that's not what the gospel says. That's not what the gospel says. The gospel says that we should think of others as better than ourselves. even those who aren't Christians. We should have the posture that the atheist you know at work or the Buddhist person you know is actually a better person than you. Because they might be. We were just talking about this in Sunday school, about not judging other people. Because they might be a better person than you are. And I don't know about you, but I know some pretty crummy people that are Christians. And I know some pretty awesome people that aren't Christian. The gospel tells us to think of others as better than ourselves. Religion leads to superiority, but the gospel leads to humility. And that's the way of the upside-down kingdom. Humility improves our relationships with others, but it also improves our relationship with ourselves. What you think of yourself is important. Up until the 20th century, traditional cultures, and this is still true of many cultures today, believed that having a view of too high of yourself was the root cause of why bad things happen and why criminals commit the crimes that they do. They believed that criminals had too high of a view of themselves. What is the reason for most of the crime and violence in the world? Why are people abused? Why are people cruel? Traditionally, the answer to that was those who committed these awful acts thought too highly of themselves. But in our modern Western culture, we have developed an answer that is completely opposite to what traditional cultures believe. The basis of contemporary education, the way we treat our incarcerated prisoners, and the starting point for modern-day counseling is the exact opposite of what traditional cultures believe is the issue. Our belief today, and it is rooted in everything, is that people misbehave because they have too low a view of themselves. Too low a view. The reason husbands abuse their wives and the reason people are criminals is because they think too low of themselves. People used to think that it was because they view too high of themselves, but now it's too low. So which one of these is right? Which one of it is right? Too high or too low? Because clearly people still do bad things, whether they think too high or too low. I don't think we've actually come up with the answer. So is the answer to why people do bad things because they think too highly of themselves or too low? The answer is neither. It's neither one. The answer is not that you're thinking too highly of yourself or that you're thinking too lowly of yourself. The answer is that you're thinking of yourself. Period. That is an answer. Humility does not mean that you think less of yourself. It means that you think of yourself less. C.S. Lewis says in his book, Mere Christianity, this quote, I love it. He says, "Pride gets no pleasure out of having something, only out of having more of it than the next person. We see that people are proud of being rich or clever or good-looking, but they're not. They're proud of being richer or cleverer or better-looking than others. If everyone else became equally rich or clever or good-looking, there would be nothing to be proud about. Comparing yourself to others is the heart of pride. The kingdom of the world tells us that we can think however we want about ourselves, we just can't share it. You can think that you're the greatest person to ever walk on this planet, you just can't tell others about it. But the gospel tells us that the problem with the world is just that, thinking of yourself more than others. That is the way of the upside-down kingdom. Humility will improve your relationship with others, it will improve your relationship to yourself, and ultimately, it will improve your relationship with God. To be poor in spirit means that you recognize your spiritual poverty. That you have to depend on God. You have to depend on God because He's not going to be impressed with you either way. You don't impress engineers at Boeing with a paper airplane. You wouldn't try to impress Tiger Woods by showing him how far you can drive a golf ball. And you wouldn't try to impress LeBron James by how many three-pointers you can shoot. You're not going to try to impress the creator of the world by how good you can be. But I believe our worst source of pride is just that. When we believe that our salvation relies on how good we are. Or when we believe that our salvation relies on how much money I give away, or how often I come to church, or how nice I am to other people. The ultimate source of pride is when we believe that we can earn our salvation. Because when you think that you can earn a spot in heaven by being good, Jesus is no longer your Savior. You are. Because it's based off your performance, not His. When you believe that you can earn your salvation, you're saying that you can save yourself by trying harder and being a better person, but none of it matters because you do it all with the wrong heart. To be poor in spirit means that you understand Romans 3:23, that we all sin and fall short of the glory of God. We're all broken people. And there's nothing that we could ever do to try to save ourselves. Nothing we could ever do. Our only hope is if God himself decides that we're worth something, that we're worth saving. And I've got some good news, because he did. He does think that. He thinks we're worth something. We're worth saving. Philippians 2, 5 through 9 says, in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name. God humbled himself to become one of us. And then he was so humble that he died. He was so humble that he died in the most humiliating way possible. And he did it for you. He did it for you. And it's because of what Jesus did that you were saved. Not by what you do, but what he did. This last week I took a trip to Los Angeles for a class I'm in at Ozark. And I remember sharing the story a little bit briefly in Sunday school last week, but I was at this dinner at this restaurant in LA, and I was meeting with some other church planters and people in ministry, and I was talking to them and whatever. And afterwards, I had to get an Uber back to my house where I was staying at. An Uber, if you don't know what that is, it's whenever you get on your phone and you call someone to come pick you up, and you pay them to take you where you want to go. And so I called an Uber, and I waited a few minutes, and he showed up, and I waved at him, and I got in. And he's a great dude. His name was Takashi. Takashi was a Japanese-American man, and he grew up in Japan his whole life, but he moved to America whenever he was about 15, maybe early high school. And so, we were just talking. He was a very talkative person, and so one thing led to another. We started talking, about our beliefs and about religion. And he told me that he was a Buddhist, and that he grew up in Japan as a Buddhist. That's what he grew up practicing. And so I just asked him, what do you think about Buddhism? He's like, I don't know. And then he asked me this question. He asked me, why are you a Christian? And you know what I told him? You know what I said? I told him because all the religions in the world are based off your what's the word? Your performance. Man, I really went on. I told him, all the religions in the world are based off your performance. How you perform ultimately leads to your salvation. So if you're really good, you'll please God and you'll get to heaven. But if you're not, then you're going to hell. All religions in the world believe this, except Christianity. All the religions except Christianity. Christianity is not based on your performance. It's based on Jesus' performance. And thank God, because I don't think I could do that. I don't think I could. That is at the heart of Christianity, the humility of Christianity. And guys, that's where we find ultimate happiness. To know that your identity is wholly and completely in God. That's what it means to be poor in spirit. That's what it means to be a part of the upside down kingdom. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for being the perfect example for our humility. I'm so grateful that our salvation is based on your performance and not ours. Thank you for loving us, even though we have nothing to offer you. We are broken and sinful, and we literally have nothing to offer you, but you still find worth in us. And you came down, and you sacrificed yourself for us. And that is the ultimate source of humility. Thank you for being a perfect example for us. It's in your name I pray. Amen.
All right.